Welcome, everyone. My name is Maritza Perez Medina. I'm the director of DPA's Office of Federal Affairs. The Drug Policy Alliance, or DPA, is the leading organization in the U.S. working to end the war on drugs. We address the harms of drug use and drug criminalization through policy solutions, organizing, and public education. We advocate for a holistic approach to drugs that prioritizes health, social supports, and community well-being. DPA opposes punitive approaches that destabilize people, block access to care, and drain communities of resources. We believe that the regulation of drugs should be grounded in evidence, health, equity, and human rights. In collaboration with other movements, we change laws, we advance justice, and we save lives. As you know, today we'll be discussing kratom and 7-OH regulation. With varied efforts at the federal and state level to ban or regulate these substances, this is a timely and important discussion. In the past few years, over half of U.S. states have introduced legislation to regulate or criminalize kratom and/or kratom derivatives, including 7-OH. At the federal level, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, recommended scheduling 7-OH under the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA. And in fact, just last week, the DEA moved to place 7-OH above a specified threshold in Schedule 1 of the CSA. And for background, the Schedule 1 placement represents the most severe schedule of the CSA. In addition to that, the DEA is recommending that 3 derivatives of 7-OH be temporarily placed on Schedule 1 of the CSA. Together, these actions effectively prohibit 7-OH. Additionally, the House Chamber of the U.S. Congress has introduced a bill to move 7-OH to Schedule 1 of the CSA. All the while, President Trump has signaled interest in approving kratom for medicinal use. The reality is that across the country, people use kratom for a variety of purposes, while lawmakers remain divided on how best to provide education and support to reduce the potential harms of products sold as kratom and 7-OH. So what's the way forward? In this webinar, we will discuss the current status and the future of kratom and 7-OH. We'll answer your questions such as who uses these substances and what health benefits and risks do people experience? What is the legal status of kratom products and what can we expect moving forward? What are the impacts of regulating, scheduling, or banning kratom, 7-OH, and other emerging drugs? And how might prioritizing regulation over criminalization lead to greater oversight of manufacturing and sales, more consumer safety and education, and reduced health risks? We will also leave you with a couple of calls to action, urging you to contact your government officials to push back against federal prohibition. To start the conversation, I will now pass it to my colleague, Kellen Rusinello, our Director of Public Health, who will moderate this discussion and introduce you to our esteemed panel. Kellen?
Thank you so much, Maritza. Hello, everybody. My name is Kellen Rusinello. I am the Director of Public Health with the Drug Policy Alliance. And just a few housekeeping manners before we get into the meat of the discussion. If you would like to access the live transcription and cannot see it now, please click the Show Captions icon in the Meetings Control toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or need assistance, you can message the panelists. AI-based note-taking and transcription tools are not permitted and will be blocked from accessing the session. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all of the registrants. I will now start the moderation of a discussion with the panelists, and then we will have about 20 minutes at the end for audience questions. Please feel free to submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A feature throughout the session. And without further ado, we are going to jump into our panel discussion. We have 5 great panelists with us today. We have Dr. Shoshana Aronowitz from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, Catherine Hill from the Yale School of Public Health, Dr. Stacy McKenna from the R Street Institute, Kat Packer from the Drug Policy Alliance, and Dr. Darshan Singh from the Center for Drug Research at University Science Malaysia. We're going to be posting their bios in the chat for you to learn more about their backgrounds. But we're going to jump into it now. And to set the stage a little bit, I'm going to ask our panelists to explain, what are kratom and 7-OH, and these other derivatives that we are starting to see. And I think I will first pass it over to Darshan to take us off away.
All right. Can you hear me, Kellen?
Yes,
Can you hear me? All right.
yes,
Okay.
we can.
So
Thank
thank
you.
you very much. I think it's very important for me to distinguish, to give a bit of background about the kratom market, what is actually happening. Now, we need to understand that the kratom product market is evolving rapidly, and consumers have started to use highly potent kratom products. These are semi-synthetic or novel analogs, which are far more harmful. So it is important to distinguish between traditional kratom products and commercial kratom products. Now, in Southeast Asia, kratom products, that comes in the form of powder and solution, are purely prepared from fresh leaves. Now, kratom is widely consumed in US and in Europe today, and most consumers believe that semi-synthetic kratom products like 7-OH and novel analogs, mitragynine, pseudoindoxil, MGM 15 and 16, are actually kratom. But for us, it is actually not kratom. If this is not the traditional kratom product. So what has changed thus far? Kratom is now seen as a harmful drug having equivalent or stronger effects than opioids. And kratom products have been chemically modified to increase its potency. Now you get to see semi-synthetic kratom products. You get to see the 7-OH concentrations are significantly higher than what you can actually find in natural leaf in Southeast Asia. Now, if you were to compare kratom market in Southeast Asia, we only have one product, but the market in the US has been flooded with highly enhanced and semi-synthetic kratom products. Now, this development is quite alarming and it has contributed to adverse health events, including deaths. Now, people have developed kratom dependence and have been treated with opioid-based therapy. These are some of the developments that is actually taking place in the US. We also need to remember this, like I was telling you, the differences between traditional kratom products and commercialized kratom products. Now, if you look at traditional kratom products, mitragynine is the most abundant alkaloid, and the content of mitragynine is always fluctuating in Southeast Asia because we don't have a standardized kratom product. And 7-hydroxymitragynine, nobody talks about 7-OH because 7-OH is only detected in trace amount in kratom leaf as well as in the decoction. And in traditional settings, traditional kratom products are illegally distributed. Um, and the products are not as potent as what you find today in the US and in the European market. And traditional kratom products have a very limited abuse potential. And I would also say that kratom decoction is the dominant product widely used in Southeast Asia. Though, if you happen to go to Thailand, you get to see people still practice kratom chewing behaviors. Now, when you come back to commercial kratom products, we get to see mitragynine concentration is, of course, higher than the leaf limit today in most of the kratom products that are in the market. 7-OH has been erased to intensify its potency. And consumers have access to potent kratom products. And I believe that these semi-synthetic or synthetic kratom products have a very high abuse potential. And now we also get to see, as I was saying just now, the market is evolving. You get to see more novel analogs disguised as kratom being marketed. Yeah, that's all from me.
Great. Thank you so much. And you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more and maybe Shoshana, you could jump in here too about who uses kratom and 7-OH and other derivatives.
Sure. I can jump in for a moment. So we, have some information about people's motivation for using these products. Shout out to Katie Hill for some of this really important research. So we know that there are, kind of some like
specific kind of groups of people who use these products and the reasons they use these products. So chronic pain is a big one. A lot of people choose to use these products to treat chronic pain, anxiety and depression. There are some people who use these products, and identify their use as recreational. And then there's, an important subset of folks who use these products to treat other substance use disorders. And I think this is something that I see a lot in my clinical practice. These findings like really do mirror what I see and what I hear from people who, are seeking substance use disorder treatment for kratom or 7-OH or other derivative use disorder. A lot of people will say, I started using these products to manage another use disorder. So, I think it's a specific population of people because these are people who are seeking substance use disorder treatment. So they've identified that they have some sort of issue with their use. But, among this population, we really see like a very high percentage of people who, when they tell you their history, it becomes clear that they had another opioid use disorder in the past. And I know we're going to talk more about this as the webinar goes on, but I think this is something that's really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about, limiting availability of these products, like why people are using them and what need the products are filling for them.
If I could also just add on a little bit to Shoshana's this thing now, we also need to understand in traditional settings here in Southeast Asia, we get to see kratom is widely used by farmers, manual laborers. So this is one group. Another group is people with health issues like diabetes, hypertension. They are also using it as a supplement, to treat their chronic diseases. But of course, we don't have evidence to show whether, you can use kratom to treat diabetic or hypertension. Now, we also get to see another small group of people, and this group is actually growing. These are people who use drugs like heroin and methamphetamine. So now we get to see a lot of people who are dependent on illicit drugs or people with substance use disorders using kratom. So if you look at kratom use among people who use drugs, we get to see that people who use heroin and methamphetamine or crystal methamphetamine, kratom appears more appealing to them. And the reason why they use kratom is, of course, to treat opioid use disorder or to ease drug withdrawal, to prevent relapse. And of course, it is being used to improve work productivity in Southeast Asia.
Great, thank you both. And Shoshana, maybe I'll come back to you for a second. If we could jump in and talk a little bit about, what are some of the health risks that we see associated with use of kratom, 7-OH, and other related products?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So again, speaking from the substance use treatment perspective, like this is a special subset of folks because these are people who are coming, identifying that they have a problem. Of course, there's many other people you assume who aren't seeking treatment. It could be because they don't know where to go or whatever, or it could be because they're like, I don't need treatment. I think everything's going fine for me. This is really helping me. But what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from my patients, for many people, the reasons they're coming to treatment is because they're like, sort of the classic things you hear from people with opioid use disorders, like developing a tolerance and having like really significant withdrawal symptoms when they try to quit, spending a lot of money. So like financial toxicity, which is causing issues, for them and their families. We don't see, and I think probably others on the panel could speak to this too, like we're not seeing the same, like high risk of overdose death with these products. Like we are hearing reports of overdoses often combined with other substances. But, what I'm seeing is people coming and, really identifying that they have a very serious issue and really suffering because of the use disorder. And I think another piece that complicates it is for many people, they don't know where to seek care. So that's another problem, is that people might not realize like, okay, maybe like an opioid use disorder program is a place where I could seek treatment. There's also all the the barriers that we know to seeking substance use disorder treatment in the US. And I've also heard many reports of people going to a treatment center and the clinicians having no idea what they're talking about, so being turned away from seeking care. So definitely among the people that I'm seeing, like they're saying that it's really devastating their lives. Again, though, I think it's important to remember that these are folks seeking treatment, and that might not be the case for everybody using them.
And if I could just jump in quickly and touch on this kind of concept of potential addiction, and as Darshan mentioned, the kind of policy term abuse liability for both kratom, potentially mitragynine, as well as 7-OH. Most of the stuff that, that the policy cites is related to animal literature and like preclinical studies. There hasn't been sufficient, in my opinion, sufficient research in humans yet. So just to touch on kind of the pharmacology right now. So mitragynine, or the kind of primary alkaloid in kratom, and I say primary because it's usually the most abundant. It's a partial weakly binding mu-opioid agonist, but it also has activity at adrenergic receptors, downstream dopaminergic activity, and it works synergistically with major and minor alkaloids. Whereas 7-OH is less promiscuous. It's highly selective at the mu-opioid agonist. And when people say it's more potent, they're typically misciting a study that showed it was 22 times more likely to bind to the mu-opioid receptor than morphine. So it's essentially stickier, but that doesn't necessarily translate to potency. And there's mixed results as to whether it's a full or partial agonist at the mu-opioid receptor. And it really has relatively low bioavailability with a short mean residence time in the brain. So its actual functional potency is relatively unclear. And it's relatively unclear if all of these kind of like PK findings will actually translate in humans, particularly for abuse liability. And I use that phrasing lightly. And then when we think about the kind of like addiction related research, we've certainly found that it is possible for folks to develop a DSM defined, substance use disorder for both kratom and for 7-OH. And these are largely driven by kind of the pharmacological criteria. So thinking of things like withdrawal intolerance, and potentially cravings. I think that all that to say that I think folks are really concerned by the term opioid, but there's a lot to be, thinking about here beyond just the pharmacology of these substances. And I think so I'll leave it at that. And I'm not sure if any of my other panelists have anything to add, but there's a lot going on in this space.
Yeah, and I think that raises a really good point. Is like there's still a lot to learn about these substances that we don't know yet, and that could potentially be made much more difficult if they are scheduled because research becomes much more difficult. Um, and I'm wondering, Katie, if I could stick with you for a second. Shoshana was mentioning, people trying to access services when they do discover that they're having, issues with their use, and often finding barriers. So what are strategies that, people can use to reduce harm associated with using kratom or 7-OH or related substances?
Yeah, so she makes a really great point about, not only has there been success in the treatment space of folks accessing MOUD, and there's some really great case studies out there if there's any clinicians on the call. So I'd suggest looking at those resources. My colleague Kirsten Smith and I also did a podcast for ASAM recently that I think, not to like brag about that, but I think also is relatively a good resource for the kind of treatment aspect. But in terms of kind of more harm reduction things, so she also mentions that we're living in a polysubstance use world, right? So it's important to recognize that folks that are using kratom, 7-OH, and these other substances are usually not using these substances in isolation. So for instance, we published a study a couple of years ago that showed that most people that are using kratom are also using cannabis, just as one example. And in most of our studies on kratom consumers and 7-OH consumers, most of the people that respond to these studies are using a variety of substances, from caffeine and alcohol and vaping to, fentanyl and stimulants, right? And so it's really important to understand that we can, of course, use harm reduction techniques appropriately, such as using naloxone, not using alone, using a hot spotting line, and so forth, because we understand that in most of the fatalities that are observed with 7-OH and kratom, most of those have another substance involved, right? There usually is fentanyl or alcohol or benzodiazepine or something like that. So we do have a host of harm reduction tools that are already in our toolkit, of course, that we can use. And unfortunately, in terms of like specific techniques for harm reduction that are related to kratom and 7-OH, the policies that are in place now are only going to make it harder to kind of learn what those harm reduction techniques are. But I can share a few. Of course, going low and slow will always apply. But in our studies, we found that folks that have been very much seeking like community forums such as Reddit for kind of like peer support. There's also a great website called testmykratom.org where folks are testing kratom and 7-OH products for like potential contaminants and adulterants. And that's kind of just fun to check out and browse. So those are just some examples of like harm reduction and keeping yourself safe that I can suggest for folks.
Kellen, if I could also just add a little bit on what Kathy did mention. Now, in Malaysia, right, or in Southeast Asia in general, if you were to look at the literature, you will never come across people who are dependent on traditional kratom products coming forward to seek treatment. You rarely hear about people coming forward to seek treatment, but unfortunately today, now like I was telling you, our laws are becoming a bit more oppressive and repressive. People are coming in to seek treatment for kratom dependence. Now, what is actually happening in Malaysia, it's also a bit shocking because now kratom is seen to have opioid properties, and the clinicians believe that kratom, people with kratom dependence issues, or you can actually call kratom use disorder, that has been coined, the term has been coined in the US. Now you get to see our clinicians here in Malaysia, I would say, because I've done a study, we found that they are treating people who only use kratom products with opioid-based therapy. I do not agree using methadone because we have buprenorphine. It's a bit expensive. It's available in private settings, but methadone is available in government settings. So we get to see people who only use kratom. In fact, you should not put them on opioid-based therapy because they have no underlying opioid use disorder unless someone who uses opioid on top of opioid use, and they use kratom, you can actually prescribe methadone or buprenorphine because they have an underlying problem to do with opioid use disorder. But I completely disagree with the practice where people who use traditional kratom products, they only experience mild to moderate dependence and withdrawal severity, and there is no need to put them on opioid-based therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Darshana. Shoshana, I wonder if you have any response to that, given some of the research that you've been doing around buprenorphine.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was going to mention earlier was that, in our clinical practice, the majority of the patients we're seeking treatment are people who endorse using the derivative products more than people who, we have had some people who have said that they have, used like natural leaf kratom, but the majority of people using derivative products, as has been discussed, I mean, I think part of the issue, depending on where you are and what's available to you, and your knowledge about these products, like I have found it helpful to, if possible, to be like, can you show me the package of what you're using? Because sometimes people don't always know exactly what they're using. And again, even when to Katie's point, like, Test My Kratom is a helpful resource because people, what the package says might not be what's in it even. So it can be difficult sometimes to figure out what folks are using, but yes, the majority of people that we've seen seeking treatment are saying that they're using the derivatives rather than natural leaf kratom.
Just to add to both y'all, and I'm not a clinician, but I think Darshan, you raised a great point that in the United States context, where both kratom and 7-OH are available, we try to say to clinicians, at least in the conversations I've had across the country, that taking in someone's prior opioid exposure as well as like current synthetic kratom use as well as like 708 use, is incredibly important to decide what like at what MOUD and at what dose is most appropriate. So I think you guys are both absolutely in the right space.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I think we're going to shift the conversation a little bit to talk now about like the regulatory status of kratom and other products here. Um, so first I'll turn it over to Kat. Can you tell us, what we're starting to see in terms of regulation of kratom and other, 7OH and other synthetic derivatives? And what are we seeing at the federal level?
Yeah, thanks, Kellen. I think for the purposes of this conversation, I want to be able to walk through how both the Controlled Substances Act and the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Acts treat these substances, and then consider actions that the DEA and FDA has taken since 2016. And I imagine part of the conversation will also focus on examining the DEA's most recent actions related to filing its notice of intent to temporarily schedule 7OH and related substances. So under the Controlled Substances Act and within the five schedules on the Controlled Substances Act, of course, the DEA has the ability to schedule, reschedule, or deschedule substances through regulation under the CSA. And at least to date, kratom 7OH are not considered controlled substances. Now, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA can regulate both drugs and dietary supplements sold in the United States, but it's important to note that the FDA has approved no drug products containing kratom, metragenine, or 7OH, and they've taken the position that FDA has taken the position that kratom is an unapproved new dietary ingredient. And as such, it's not appropriate for use as a dietary supplement, specifically because there's inadequate scientific information that such ingredient does not pose a significant or unreasonable risk to the public. They've also essentially articulated that when added to a food, it is an unsafe food additive, and any food that contains kratom is considered adulterated. So that's essentially, at least up until this point, how the Controlled Substances Act and the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act has treated these particular substances. But going back to 2016, it was back in 2016 that the DEA had originally published a notice of intent to place 7OH in Schedule 1 on an emergency basis, but it essentially withdrew that notice after numerous comments were submitted by members of the public and advocacy organizations. Since then, however, the DEA has designated kratom as a drug and chemical of concern, and the FDA has taken a number of steps to essentially try and limit the unlawful sale of kratom products in the U.S. This has included the issuance of various import alerts, and specifically mainly between 2023 and 2025, the issuance of a number of warning letters. And these warning letters were sent both directly to companies who were manufacturing and selling these products, and warning letters directly to consumers, letting consumers know that these products have not been proven as safe or effective for any use. And then, as my colleague Maritza mentioned at the top of this call, most recently, last week, we saw the DEA file its notice of intention to temporarily schedule 7OH and related substances. I can spend some time talking about what that looks like and what that means, but Kellen, I'll pass it back to you if we want to cover other topics first.
Yeah, and I think we will likely come back to that. But I wonder, Stacy, if you could jump in here and talk a little bit about, obviously there's the federal government, but then we have 51 plus jurisdictions who might be regulating it in their own way, and a lot have taken action prior to the federal government. So I could wonder if you could talk a little bit about what states are doing and trends that you're seeing in regulation.
Yeah, thanks, Kellen. The as mentioned, right? Like we're seeing this across a number of jurisdictions. We're seeing regulations pop up in local jurisdictions, right? So there's a number in California that have tried to do something at the local level. We've also seen state level regulation pop up. And sometimes this is regulation. Sometimes it's about age gating, right? So preventing people under 21 or 18 from having access. Sometimes it's a full-on ban. So some states are trying to place kratom or 7-OH or some of the other alkaloids on their schedule, right? So at Schedule 1 typically. And then others are trying to talk about things like thresholds for how much of certain alkaloids can be in a product, banning those, allowing other products. Trying to come up with, there's some conversation, like there have been some study groups, there's some conversation around dosing and things like that. And what this is really leading us to is we're seeing this just total patchwork across states, which is not that surprising, especially if we look at the history with cannabis, if we look at even the history with the way that say lower risk tobacco and nicotine products are being regulated across the US, right? Like we see a lot of parallels with different kinds of substances when we start to see states and localities get involved with it. What I think is really important to consider, and I think we're going to be moving into this again later, is that the science on kratom and 7-OH and their effect is new enough in terms of these like threshold conversations and dose conversations that while such regulation could potentially be a way forward to allow these on a consumer marketplace in a way that potentially protects consumers, we don't actually have the science yet to know what that should be. And this is where I'm going to stop now and let Kellen bring it back to Kellen, because I know that we'll come back to what scheduling in these bans actually do.
Yes, we'll get there in just a second, I promise. But before we do, I wanted to ask Darshan if you could talk a little bit about what the regulatory status is in Southeast Asia, especially because that's where kratom grows.
Yeah, so thank you, Kellen. So now, when it comes to regulatory aspect of kratom, now, despite its long history of use, you get to see kratom is regulated inconsistently across different jurisdictions in Southeast Asia. Now, kratom is regulated in most countries, despite, like I was telling you, despite its long history of use. Eventually, you get to see kratom is regulated. However, in Thailand, the government have actually given some kind of leeway for people to use kratom for its traditional purposes. And in fact, in the first place, kratom was regulated for more than a century. Eventually, they found that, people who have been using kratom should not be deprived of their right. And in fact, the government have actually allowed people to use kratom traditionally in Thailand. Now, coming back to Malaysia, mitragynine is actually regulated under the Poisons Act. It is not under the Dangerous Drugs Act, under the Poisons Act. And so and of course, when it is regulated, nobody is actually allowed to consume kratom. And even if you are caught for possession of kratom leaf material or mitragynine, you could be sent to the jail, because now they have actually increased the fines from like 10,000 ringgit Malaysia to 100,000 ringgit Malaysia. And most who are using kratom are rural folks. They can't afford to pay a court fine. And you get to see them coming into the prison and serving a minimum of 5 years imprisonment. So this is something which is not right. And the most bizarre thing here is when consumption is criminalized, but cultivation remains legal in Malaysia. So you can actually grow kratom around your house. But it becomes an offense if you happen to possess, leaf, or plug them or consume them. And just to add on a little bit, just about 2 years ago, we have actually amended our Drug Dependence Act. So very soon, it is not very soon, it's really happening right now. So authorities will actually have the autonomy to stop anybody suspected to have actually used kratom. And if you happen to use kratom, and if your urine turns out to be positive, you could be sent to undergo mandatory rehabilitation for a period of 2 years. Now, this is the most paradoxical thing. Someone who is dependent on traditional kratom products, I believe that they can actually give up kratom use easily. You don't need to put them into a mandatory drug rehabilitation for a period of 2 years. So this is what is actually happening in Malaysia. And you need to remember this. Kratom export is strictly regulated across all jurisdictions in Southeast Asia. But I'm a bit surprised how furtive deals have been endorsed to allow kratom trade. You see, if you access the internet, you get to see, vendors saying that kratom products are coming in from Malaysia, coming in from Thailand, coming in from Indonesia. But again, there is a ban on kratom export. And this is the thing. Now, individuals identified, we get to see a lot of individuals identified as exhibiting signs of dependence. Like I was telling you now, they will be ordered to undergo compulsory rehabilitation. So these are some of the developments in Malaysia. And of course, kratom is also regulated in Indonesia. But again, there is, some kind of leeway being given to support kratom trade.
Great, thank you. Um, And so you've mentioned some of the harms that can come along with certain ways of regulating kratom in a criminalized way. But coming back to you, Stacey, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what impacts would scheduling have in the United States for people who use these substances.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the challenges with scheduling, especially Schedule 1, right, is that it adds this massive barrier to conducting research. And as multiple folks on this call have already talked about, right, like there's still a lot for us to learn in order to build safe, smart, effective policy that also respects individual autonomy and allows consumers to access a product that is maybe beneficial to them, or maybe they enjoy and it's not causing harms, right? So if we can get more science on this, we can actually start to build a regulatory system that makes sense, that's smart, that is following science, that is based on things like understanding dose, right? Like so that you don't do the equivalent of a shot when you think that you're just taking a sip of wine, right? Like right now, we don't know that with a lot of kratom products, or consumers don't. But then we've got this other side of scheduling, and it's the criminalization side. And what we see when we prohibit a legal marketplace and a regulated marketplace for things, then we start to see a total loss of transparency. People really don't know what's in their products. We have some questions around what's in the product now. It's a bit of a Wild West. However, when you start banning, then people really don't know. Look at the illicit marketplace for drugs in the United States right now. It is legitimately scary for people on a daily basis. We also start to see people, if they lose access, there's a risk of them turning to that illicit marketplace, especially if they're suffering from a kratom use disorder, especially if they have dependence on these substances and don't know where else to turn. The minute we start talking about criminalization, people are less likely to seek treatment. This is something that we see again and again with illegal drugs, right? That folks, when things are criminalized, they're not only less likely to engage in safer behaviors, they're often scared to seek treatment around it or even tell their doctor that they're taking it. And then there's always the risk of this turning into like creating an incentive for a more dangerous substance via the iron law of prohibition. And I'm going to turn it over to Kat with DPA, because I feel like you all are always really good at describing that and like what that consequence can look like and mean for people.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. I mean, the reality is that in particular, and Stacey, you were talking about some of the regulatory efforts that exist at the state, where state governments are able to put in place policies that can mandate what's on a warning label or what the specific content is. We lose all of those abilities for control and market oversight when things are scheduled and criminalized. And in order to circumvent criminal penalties or policies that are in place, it is, likely that the market will develop other substances that are just as potent or more dangerous. Part of what is, interesting and hypocritical in part is that in the notices of intent to temporarily schedule 7-OH and these three related substances, in the notices themselves, you can see the DEA opine about their various concerns about some of these substances. And for example, they talk about the lack of established safe consumption limits and standardized dosing, the inability to know the identity, purity, or product formulation, that there are a lack of good manufacturing products, concerns around marketing claims or health claims that these products and manufacturers are making. These are the very things that regulators can control for on the market when there are policies in place to regulate these products as opposed to criminalizing them. And so we have an opportunity in this moment to ensure that these products are not further criminalized and that the consumers that are relying on these products or utilizing these products aren't pushed towards more dangerous avenues.
Great, thank you so much. And before we kind of jump into like what we think an effective policy would look like, which we touched on a little bit, I'm wondering, Katie, if you could talk about sort of what are the forces behind how the federal government is thinking about this and why are they targeting 7-OH and synthetic derivatives, but not natural leaf kratom? I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of what are the political and other forces that might be behind that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I began doing kratom research, around 5 years ago, I started doing this work. I thought it was an interesting product. It felt like no one really cared about it, and it just kind of showed up to me as like a product that had a lot of potential for folks that use drugs and harm reduction potentially. And I've been really surprised over the past 2 or 3 years just how political this research space has been. And I can tell y'all just a few things that I've come to understand in this space is, first is that the lobbying groups for Kratom and 7-OH, I think, are incredibly wealthy and powerful. And in my opinion, I think it's likely because these groups have been funded by products that have been very successful in the marketplace, and also they have primarily white bases of supporters. Second, it's important to recognize if you're new to this space that despite the kind of like botanical connection and pharmacological similarities, these groups are in direct opposition to one another. So if you were to walk into like a vape shop, maybe not this week, but if you were to last week, the Kratom and 7-OH products are very much competing for shelf space. So to put it simply, the like Kratom lobby or the AKA believes that 7-OH is like a threat to their market share and viability kind of long term in terms of policy, right? So they see that 7-OH, maybe because it's advertised as kind of more potent or maybe is more opioid-like, that maybe is a threat to kratom. And the 7-OH lobby believes that the actions of the kratom lobby going after 7-OH is going to get baby thrown out with the bathwater, right? And I've come to understand that the science is really kind of getting pushed to the wayside, as Stacy and Kat and everybody has mentioned. And it's really clear to me, especially over the past few months, and I've seen some questions in the chat about it, that folks that are in, positions of power, so RFK and the president and others in prominent positions, I think had a reason, of course, to want a win for their voting bloc at a time when, their potential, approval ratings are relatively low. And I think banning what a lot of people call, gas station heroin is a relatively easy win for those that might not read the finer print of some of the stuff Stacey is talking about and Kat's talking about. And what makes things worse is that RFK is definitely buddies with a leading kratom vendor who donates to the Maha PAC, right? And so these current policy decisions really can't be disentangled from the complex relationships that I just described, some deals behind doors, money and power, and more, right? So drug policy has always been political, and this is certainly another case of that. And unfortunately, as a scientist, right, the policy here does not seem to be driven by science and evidence. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, really, really appreciate that background. And, we can kind of see where policy is headed when it's been directed by politics and commercialism. But what would an effective policy look like? What policies do we need to keep people who use kratom, 7-OH, and other, related products safe? Maybe I'll pass that to Kat first to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Kellen. I think part of what makes this conversation challenging is because of the politicalization of the conversation. We're not getting the best science or evidence to frame the actual information that consumers need about what these products are and what their relative risks are. And so I think one of the most important regulations that can be inserted into this conversation is making sure that there are appropriate product labels. And we've seen, at least at the state level, in terms of kratom regulation, some examples of what this could look like. And want to offer that there are differences in kratom related products and 7-OH related products, and there may be differences in risks associated with those products. And so there may need to be differences in the regulatory controls. But in terms of labels, for example, I have a couple of examples here. Nebraska, in terms of its kratom products, it requires a recommendation that this is not recommended for individuals who are under 21, pregnant, or breastfeeding, that a healthcare practitioner should be consulted prior to use, that the statements have not been evaluated by the FDA, that the product is not intended to treat, cure, or prevent disease, directions for use, a listing of ingredients and servings per container. These are, basic types of information that consumers across the board come to expect when they are purchasing commercial products. And this is the type of information that could be extremely helpful for consumers as they're trying to make decisions about what these products are and what their relative effects may be. Similarly, there is or has been concern raised about various types of products that are available on the market, and in some cases the public's inability to distinguish these products from products who don't have these substances in them. And so there is an opportunity for there to be regulations on what's allowed in these products in terms of adulterants or contaminants, things that we test for in other spaces like heavy metals, salmonella, microbials, and to have essentially business accountability so that if there are operators who are going to be making a profit off of the sale of these products, there's an ability for folks to trace back where these products came from, what's in them, and if there are, adverse events, there can be mechanisms in place, for example, for recalls or adverse event reporting. I think that there have to be evidence-based regulations that are essentially focused on first the consumers and keeping them safe and safe means free from criminalization, and making sure that we have policies that protect and distinguish between personal activity and commercial activity, specific product regulation, again, and appropriate product labeling, and then having appropriate enforcement mechanisms in place for businesses to hold them accountable to ensure that they are compliant with regulations that are put in place, and to ensure that actions can be taken against folks who are in violation. But these types of controls, again, are wholly unavailable when we criminalize and schedule these products. And so we have an opportunity to, even at this point, learn from what states are doing at the state and local level in terms of their specific regulations on either kratom and 7-OH, and to try and identify best practices that would better serve the public as opposed to scheduling.
Thanks so much, Kat. Stacy, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Not much. Kat did an amazing job covering some of the most important points. I think a couple of things to just like continue to think about as we try and answer this and figure it out, right? Are like there's a knee-jerk desire in among a lot of lawmakers to sort of set a threshold limit, right? But we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges with that, even in whole leaf kratom, right? Because if it's harvested at a different time, it could have different concentrations of different alkaloids in it. If it is sitting on a shelf, that could even change the alkaloid makeup depending on how long it's sitting on the shelf. So some of these conversations also need to be about, we might need to be having different conversations when we're talking about the natural whole leaf product versus the synthetic products, and not in an assumption that synthetics are inherently dangerous and natural is inherently safe, but that they have different needs, right? We need to consider the cultivation and the manufacture just through a different lens. And that's going to make a difference. I think another thing that really needs to be talked about is just going to be like part of that package labeling. Once we figure out smart dosing, like being very explicit about what is a dose, right? And so that consumers can make a smart choice for their own health and safety. And without the barrier of criminalization and the stigma that comes along with that, there's much more opportunity for honest education, right? Like polysubstance use with kratom might be particularly dangerous, and really making that clear to folks, while you still might benefit from taking this for other reasons.
Great, thank you so much. And Shoshana, I wanted to ask you too, how does the regulation of kratom and other substances relate to our need for reform in other spaces? So, some people use kratom 7-OH because of pain or managing, withdrawal from a substance use disorder. But how might that be related to the fact that they can't access health services that would help them with those, or, other social supports that they might need? I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. This is something that we think about a lot in the substance use disorder space. I mean, kratom and these products aside, we see a lot of folks who come to us for substance use disorder treatment. They want to be prescribed buprenorphine, and they'll tell us that they have been like successfully self-managing with buprenorphine that they purchased on the street for years and years prior. And usually the reason that they haven't sought care, or haven't, been engaged in care before, is because of like past bad experiences or difficulty like finding a program, getting into a program. So it's very clear, I mean, even, like I said, kratom and these other derivatives aside, that we are really not successfully serving like many of the people who could benefit from substance use disorder treatment with our current treatment system. And I think the fact that many people are using these substances to manage either another substance use disorder or chronic pain or mental health concerns really just also highlights that people are searching for something else because what they have found available to them in the mainstream treatment system like hasn't, provided the relief that they're looking for. So I think I always like to remind myself that this is an important moment for like introspection and thinking about like what is the system like not providing people, or how are we not meeting people's needs, and why are people like looking to, take matters into their own hands and find something else that will work. I also wanted to, just before I forget, I was really happy that Kat brought up pregnancy when talking about, some of the important implications around potential regulation. We haven't really talked about pregnancy that much. And I'm not a pregnancy care provider, but I know that this is something that people who provide pregnancy care are thinking about a lot, because they are seeing patients who are pregnant saying in some cases like, oh yeah, I use these products because I want like a natural option. People view it as for treating all of these, like side effects that come along with pregnancy. Or people who have an opioid use disorder, but are so stigmatized because of the criminalization of, opioids, and feel scared to come forward and say, I'm pregnant and I need opioid use disorder treatment. So they're choosing to use other products to treat the opioid use disorder so that they won't get in trouble when they're pregnant. Unfortunately, we don't have like very much research at all about how these products, might impact pregnant people, pregnancy. So that is something that we really, I think, need more research about so we can understand, what the potential impacts are. And also this speaks to this greater issue of criminalization and how it just can result in people just like not seeking the care that they need, and how dangerous that is. One last little point I'll say, and I think Stacey was talking about this earlier, that criminalization can lead to people like not seeking care. We need much more research about this, but some of the like preliminary research and some of the things we're seeing in practice is that folks who present, to opioid use disorder treatment programs for treatment of, kratom or kratom products, often, do well in treatment programs, like stay engaged. And so I think, there might be many reasons for that. But one thing I'm thinking about is like, in a context where they're not criminalized, are they better able to do well in care because criminalization is a barrier to engaging in care? Who knows how that might change if it is, when it is criminalized. Like, it'd be interesting to see, like, are people not doing as well in care anymore? Is that like the reason why they were able to engage, because it wasn't criminalized? So I know those were a bunch of different thoughts all over the place, and I can't even remember your original question, but I hope I answered it.
No, you did great. Thank you. And it's a nice segue to our last question before we transition to Q&A, which is, we've mentioned a lot of gaps so far. Obviously research is a big gap, but I'm wondering what are folks' thoughts on what comes next? What can we all expect going forward? And I'll open the floor to whoever wants to jump in on that.
Maybe I could actually add a little bit on that, Kellen.
Great. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I think so the way forward now is, we have here from all the panelists, a lot of things, a lot of work that we need to do. And of course, the science behind kratom is still lacking. We need to do more research. Now, the way forward will be, I believe that kratom consumers should be educated about the differences between traditional kratom products and commercial kratom products or semi-synthetic kratom products that are widely available in the marketplace. And we should also this is what we also need to discuss, that kratom is not an opioid and it cannot fully substitute opioids' role. If you were to use traditional kratom products, unless you're using semi-synthetic or synthetic kratom products, of course it has equivalent potency as opioids. And I also believe that proper laws are needed to regulate the formulation and sales of traditional kratom products. Of course, we need more studies to look at some of the semi-synthetic kratom products, because this is another, we're in a catch-22 situation, because if we were to outrightly ban semi-synthetic or 7-OH products, then it could lead to other problems. So we need to deal with these problems more carefully. Chemically modified kratom products should not be labeled as kratom and must be regulated, because now everyone who is using semi-synthetic kratom products or 7-OH products, they believe it is purely kratom, but again, it is not kratom. Maybe you can come up with a different term for that kind of products. Now, we also get to see kratom can cause dependence if you use traditional kratom products. And I believe that proper treatment guidelines are needed to deal with traditional kratom users. And of course, you also need a treatment guideline to deal with people who are using semi-synthetic kratom products. Last but not least, I believe that kratom advocates must work closely with policymakers to ensure laws are properly enacted to safeguard kratom consumers.
I'll jump in next. I loved everything Darshan said. I think just to echo that, I think, as we see regulation building things that are not being driven by the latest evidence, and instead really being driven by money and power, it's really disheartening to see. But we know that the demand for these products is really not going anywhere, just because we're seeing, prohibition of 7-OH, pseudonoxyl, MGM-15, and MGM-16, which we didn't necessarily have as much time to talk about. We can expect to see novel products emerge. I think especially in the kratom space, there's over 40 alkaloids in the kratom or plant Mitragyna speciosa. It's really easy to like slap a hydroxy group or a fluoride or whatever on these alkaloids and make a new product. So if we're not going to schedule our way out of this, essentially. We did a study that'll hopefully be published in coming month or so. But we talked to 7-OH consumers and found that 80% of them wanted 7-OH to remain legal. But they wanted some restrictions and regulations, right? And that they wanted common sense regulations. And we found that 7-OH consumers with a lower income and from racially minoritized backgrounds to have around 4 to 8 times were more likely to be against prohibition. So we hypothesized that these participants were more keenly aware of the impacts of criminalization in the drug war. And participants had numerous ideas for what 7-OH policy that we're not scheduling could be like. So this would be things that Stacey and Kat talked about, right? Like stricter rules for vendor marketing, regulations around where products could be sold, a lot of other things. And 7-OH consumers were especially concerned with what they're going to do when 7-OH was no longer available on their shelves or online, right? So certainly some consumers said they would go and maybe seek treatment, go get bupe, go get MOUD. Others already had made plans about stockpiling product, making 7-OH themselves, or returning to an unregulated market, like Stacey had said. And I just want to share one quote that I think really sums up kind of the iron law of prohibition really nicely. Is quote, "Do not ban 7-OH because if you do ban it, you're going to have people panicking. People are going to hit the streets looking for drugs. At least all the people who have a previous illicit drug use record, mostly opiates, will try to find that product on the street and again, and a lot of them are going to die." End quote. So I just think this is something we're going to have to monitor in our research. We need more science on these products. We need more education for consumers and physicians alike. And we need people to engage, not just the scientists, like folks like us up here, but we need folks to engage in the policy process. So like Maritza explained earlier, to provide public comment on these issues that we're talking about today. That's my little piece.
Awesome. I think that's a really great transition to bring Maritza back to make the ask again. So I'll pass it over to you, Maritza.
Yes, thank you. So, a couple of asks for our audience today. As was mentioned at the top of this call, there are simple actions that you can take now to discourage federal prohibition of these substances. The first thing you can do is help us oppose a bill in Congress that would place 7-OH on Schedule 1 of the CSA. DPA's action alert will be dropped in the chat for you. So there it is. So you can go ahead and contact your member of Congress easily by using that link. The second thing we ask you to do is to submit comment to the DEA and HHS on its proposal, urging them to reject its temporarily scheduling threshold for 7-OH. You can check out the links provided by our friends at 7 Hope Alliance and SSDP. The link to the 7 Hope Alliance webpage will take you to SSDP's public comment tool to submit your own comment to the DEA and HHS. The public comment period closes on July 31st of this year. This is really one of the most important opportunities you can take to speak directly to federal regulators about the future of both 7-OH and kratom. You can also find information at the Seven Hope Alliance link to contact your member of Congress, urging them to weigh in with the DEA and HHS on the proposed threshold. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Maritza. And we're going to move into our Q&A section. So our first question, I think maybe Shoshana would be good to answer this is, are there any materials that we can use to provide to consumers? And what do you suggest is the most important information that should be included in like a community education pamphlet or information packet?
I saw that comment, and I believe that the person who left the comment was saying that they would be interested in maybe making something, which is awesome. If that's the person I'm thinking of, I welcome anyone else on the panel to jump into. I think really one of the important points to get across to people is this issue with package labeling, and that we really don't know if what is on the label is actually what's in the product, or the dosages, are what they say they are. I think kind of like a kernel of wisdom from like kind of general harm reduction principles, which is like start low and go slow. If you don't know what you're using, would still apply here too, because we just don't know. I think my experience talking to folks is this isn't the case for everybody, but there are many people who are very surprised to hear that like something that's sold in a store could be unregulated. Like people just don't always appreciate that like it could be sold and no one really, someone maybe knows what's in it, but it hasn't been like tested independently or anything. So I think this information is definitely worth passing along to people. And Katie shared some resources where, there is testing of products. So there is some of this happening, but that you can't necessarily know, what is in what you're using.
Just to also add on, I think so it's very important in the information package that we want to distribute to the consumers. Consumers should be made aware that kratom also has an abuse potential, because they believe that kratom is an herbal drug or herbal remedy, and it is less likely to cause dependence or substance use disorder, for example. So I don't want consumers, after using kratom for a while and they find, oh, it is so difficult to give up kratom. So the information sheet or whatever that is being informed to consumers, they should be made aware that kratom carries some kind of abuse liability.
Great, thank you. And I know this came up during the earlier discussion about overdoses involving kratom and other related substances. So this question is, are there overdoses happening that aren't combined with other substances? So it would be solely kratom or solely 7-OH. And does naloxone work for an overdose that involves kratom or 7-OH or related products?
Yeah, that's both really good questions. So there are documented cases of kratom alone overdoses. There aren't many, but there are certainly documented cases. In terms of whether or not naloxone works, I would say two things here. One, always great to give naloxone, especially because so many of the overdose cases that we do see are fatalities that involve usually polypharmacy, right? So something like fentanyl and things like that. So of course it would work in cases where there are opioids. In terms of whether it works specifically on kratom, on 7-OH, things like that. The literature is really confusing. So totally understand the question. For instance, like there's a case study that says a patient was aroused when they had a high volume of kratom. Whether aroused means a reversal of an overdose is confusing. It seems as though naloxone is always appropriate to give. Whether or not it is effective, I think is still needs to be studied, especially in humans. There are some rat studies that show that it might be effective for mitragynine and 7-OH, but I think certainly needs to be studied, but always a good tool. That's what I would say on that.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how does the DEA make assessments around something like 7-OH and kratom, and are there opportunities for advocacy? Kat, maybe you want to take that one?
Yeah, so at least for this particular notice of if its intent to temporarily reschedule, there's a specific provision of the Controlled Substances Act that allows the Attorney General to place a substance in Schedule 1 of the CSA for 2 years if they find that that placement is necessary to avoid an imminent hazard to public safety. And that's essentially the provision that the DEA is utilizing in its notice of intent to schedule 7-OH and these related substances. In order to kind of go through this determination, they are required to do an analysis and come up with findings. Specifically, they have to look at 3 of the 8 factors of their 8-factor analysis that includes the history and current pattern of abuse, the scope, duration, and significance of abuse, and what, if any, risk there is to the public. Essentially, through these notices of intent, the DEA is saying that they did that analysis for these substances and found that with these substances, there is an imminent hazard to public safety, and that they're not aware of the fact of any currently accepted medical use. There is an opportunity again for public comment on this temporary scheduling with the deadline of July 31st, but now is the opportunity for advocacy and for folks to engage, to push back and oppose the scheduling of these substances and to be advocating for sensible regulation.
Great, thanks, Kat. And Stacy, I think this next question might be for you. If these substances are going to be, likely going to be placed on Schedule 1, at least some of the derivatives. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the challenges become with continuing to do research on these substances once a substance is put into Schedule 1.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. So once a substance is placed on Schedule 1, there are a number of sort of bureaucratic hoops that scholars have to jump through in order to not just study the substance, but in order to access the substance in order to study it. We've learned with natural products like cannabis, right, that can actually lead to like really problematic. So like folks researching cannabis were required to only use like federally grown cannabis, which didn't necessarily look like market available cannabis. And so research on cannabis wasn't very reflective of what was really going on. When we're talking about other kinds of substances, right, like more synthetics or pharmaceutically produced substances, you don't have that particular problem, but you're still going to have issues around it's expensive and time consuming to get through the hurdles to be authorized to store and study these substances. And then what ends up happening a lot of the time is you end up with this loop where the timing of like grant funding, institutional approval, federal approval, possibly your state approval to study a scheduled substance, all of these things are working and they're out of sync with one another. And people end up really having a hard time being able to access it at all. They also often have requirements around storage of the substance that is beyond what a lot of universities are maybe equipped or certain labs are equipped to handle. And then there's some hesitation among some funders to even fund research on Schedule 1 substances. So we see this, I mean, it's really coming at it from a number of different places. It's not one thing that they could change to make researching Schedule 1 substances easier. It really just, it comes from a lot of different directions and becomes a problem. And I think it's noteworthy, yes, if this goes with the temporary scheduling and it goes for 2 years, then technically it would expire. We often see that it gets kicked down the road and extended. What we also see is if permanent scheduling does end up happening, the number of substances that have been rescheduled in like the last 30 years, it's like 2, right? So once a substance is placed on Schedule 1, the odds of it being rescheduled later on or descheduled is extremely low, and it is a very lengthy, involved process. So especially if we think these are substances that not only have consumer value, but could have medical utility for people, putting them on Schedule 1 is actively preventing the type of research that could help people and perhaps let us identify maybe a more effective medication for opioid use disorder or another option for folks. There are lots of potential benefits in here that we would miss out on through scheduling.
Thanks, Stacy. Maybe this one's for Katie, but whoever wants to jump in, is there a method of use or like a route of administration for these substances that is most common among people or one that is associated with higher risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for 7-OH specifically, I mean, kratom, Darshan mentioned in the beginning that like most folks are taking these either through powders or through decoction, like a liquid. But for 7-OH specifically, all the products are taking mostly through an oral route, mostly through tablets. There's a record of sublingual products, although these are more rare. So there's I see some questions in the chat regarding like vaping or smoking, is products that we don't really see records of that. The products do exist, but we've never had anyone in any of our studies really doing this. And we've never had any record of anyone injecting these products, which is important to note that most of the animal studies are through where they inject 7-OH. So just trying to compare what that might be for human studies is really difficult. So just putting that out there in terms of kind of thinking about kind of some of the harm reduction things. I think oral mode of transmission is generally safe in terms of method of use.
Thanks, Katie. We've already discussed a little bit things like age restrictions and labeling requirements, other consumer protections. In addition to those, does anyone have thoughts about how to balance potentially people who have higher tolerance and accessing things like 7-OH as an alternative to opioids and managed pains or for other reasons, versus being available for anyone, naive users, to end up with, potentially have a severe substance use disorder or other health complications? Are there other consumer protections that we can think about to sort of differentiate between who might be using the end user of the substance?
I mean, I'll start there. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but from the studies that we've done, where we ask consumers what they think about this kind of question, I think the naming of the products is, I think, one place that we can start. Stop naming the products traditional opioid names or street drug slang. No perks, no Roxys. Stop putting RX in the title. Things like that. No fake prescription things on them. I think a lot of folks that are using these products are concerned by kind of the branding and marketing. So I think this also kind of doubles up with folks that are concerned that these are potentially targeting youth and opioid naive folks. And this is not only product locations, aka gas stations and places like that, but I think that's potentially one area too. And I think just like kind of the labeling in general, being really explicit about, as Darshan mentions, kind of some folks might say abuse liability, but also just kind of in general, kind of like the potential for addiction or, things like that. I think there's a lot of places in how vendors are able to market and kind of advertise their products that are potential for regulation that are absolutely not right, scheduling or outright bans.
Yeah, and I'd want to jump in. I think that there are a number of different regulations that can be put in place, for example, to help restrict youth access. We have these conversations even in cannabis and in other spaces, but there are kind of levels to age gating. You could make it so that the entire location is age gated so that you're not even able to step on the premises without someone verifying your ID. There, of course, is the ability to verify ID before point of sales. There can be things that are just behind the counter. There can be locations where there's a specific area of that location that is age gated. There are, jurisdictions, at least in terms of kratom products, that have prevented, delivery of these products, sales through vending machines, self-service. Like these are all regulations that can be put in place to try and control how and where these products are sold. And jurisdictions also have the ability, at least now, to pass policies to restrict advertising. I'm sitting here looking at Maryland's restrictions related to kratom products. And for example, it says that retailers are not allowed to use any of the following advertising, promotion, packaging, or labeling of kratom products that include a cartoon, a superhero, a video game reference, an image of a food product primarily intended for minors, a symbol of a celebrity that is primarily associated with minors. There are specific jurisdictions that have provisions that prevent these sales from taking place within 500 feet of schools, or that disallow the provision of free samples within a certain radius of schools. There can be child resistant packaging. And so I think that there are lots of tools and controls, whether it's on the product themselves or the businesses, that can mitigate some of the harms and concerns that are raised around these products.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we have time for one more question. And beyond contacting members of Congress and submitting public comments, which we all hope folks will do, what are ways for folks to get involved in advocacy around kratom and 7-OH? Is it things like writing op-eds, talking to the media, urging professional associations to issue guidance or policy stances? What other avenues of advocacy are there for folks interested in this issue?
I can start. I think like the patient voice or personal voice has been really shut down from a lot of this because so much of the policy has been really pushed by I think power and money in this space. I think the first time kratom got put on the kind of chopping block, there was this really kind of amazing effort by kratom consumers to lift up their voices and explain why they were using this, especially from, for instance, a lot of veterans. And I think for substances like 7-OH, pseudo, we don't really see MGM 15 and 16 as much, but especially 7-OH, we're not really seeing the same robust, personal stories of, how 7-OH has been helping folks. So I think that's one space is really highlighting, those personal stories, whether it be through contacting media, contacting your senators. I think that's one space that I think lifting up the voices of folks that are using these substances would be great.
If I can also add a little bit, I think the media has to play a more proactive role. The narrative around kratom has to be positive, because when you said a lot of negative things about kratom, people try to perceive kratom as a harmful substance. The same thing that is actually happening on semi-synthetic kratom products. The signs are still very limited. And like what Stacey said, you cannot completely ban something that is giving some kind of benefits to people. So I think we need to deal with this situation more carefully. And I believe that the media has to play a more ethical role in narrating their stories about kratom. Yeah.
And I think in the clinical space, I mentioned this before, but and I know that there's other clinicians on this call who have experience treating patients with use disorders. And I'm really glad that you're here. And a lot of people really don't know how to provide care for these patients. And so I think it's really important for folks who do have experience, treating this population to train others so that, when people do seek treatment, they're not met with like confused looks by, treatment providers about what they're using, and making sure, that like people know where they can go to get treatment too. Because I think that's another part of it is that some people find themselves, with issues and don't actually know like where they can go to get care.
I'll just jump in and say that I think education is extremely important. And sometimes can feel like a lower lift than advocacy, but I think there's going to need to be advocacy in the short term around the temporary scheduling initiative, but particularly at the state level. And we see this with many other substances, but states are really leading the effort to try and regulate these products. And there are often various levels of expertise about the products that these folks are regulating. And so I think that there's an opportunity for stakeholders, particularly consumers who are impacted by these policies, to be more intentional about their engagement with state regulators, in part because there is a gap that is being created and widened at the federal level by some of these policies. And we have an opportunity, at least to model at the state level, what more reasonable regulation looks like.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we are at time, but I do want to say thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with us. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar to folks. But before we go, I'm going to pass it back over to my colleague Maritza to close us out.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for attending. This was such a wonderful discussion. The one thing I wanted to leave the audience with is that it's really important, yes, that you engage on these substances, both 7-OH and kratom. But I want to say that broadly, we've seen the federal government take the same approach with emerging substances, where the knee-jerk reaction is to automatically schedule them. And often that scheduling is prohibitive and brings about new criminal penalties and research implications. So it's really important that we engage on these issues, not just because this is important, but we really need to show the federal government and lawmakers broadly that this is the wrong-headed approach to drug policy making, that we need to center science, human rights, health. And together we can do that. Together we can show them that regulation grounded in those principles and not prohibition is the way forward. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you at an event soon.